We often take water for granted, especially here in the United States. But lawyer, entrepreneur, and activist Seth Siegel has made a powerful argument that we should pay more attention to water, both in our own communities and around the world. In his eye-opening new book, Let There Be Water, Israel's Solution for a Water-Starved World, Mr. Siegel shows us how, against all odds, Israel managed to turn its water problem into water abundance, and he outlines how that desert nation can serve as a model of cutting-edge water innovation for all countries. And joining me now to talk about Let There Be Water, already a New York Times bestseller, is Seth Siegel. Seth, welcome.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
Now, Seth, 60% of Israel is desert.
Right.
The rest is semi-arid, which means semi-desert.
Yeah.
So how did this small country with limited resources become a water superpower?
You know, what happened really was that from its very first days, even before it was a state, it made the decision that water security was going to be a central concern of the state, nearly existential. In the same way that Israel was concerned about security and it built a great army, and it was concerned about great immigration absorption, it also thought that water would be essential to its future and its destiny. It wasn't trying to become, the world's great water superpower. What it was trying to do was to make sure it had enough water that it would be able to fuel a fast-growing population, and they hoped for a fast-growing economy. They were right, and now that we have an ever-drying world with drought cropping up almost everywhere, it's now going to be a model for the world at large.
Now, you make this connection all through the book. Are you suggesting that if Israel hadn't created that superb water infrastructure, there would not have been a state of Israel?
Well, I don't know how they could almost have done that. With the fact that they would have been limping by. The economy could not have been what it was. They couldn't have had the growth of their society as it was. And so it would have been more like, say, countries like Jordan or Yemen or Sudan. I mean, those countries somehow or other make do. But I would argue that even those countries in the near term are going to have some pretty big problems, and another 10 or 15 years when their aquifers start to really deplete, they'll have very little water left. So Israel prepared for its future long, long ago. It's a lesson for all of us.
Now, you also make the connection between the Jewish faith and the Jewish relationship to water. Talk about that.
Well, it's an interesting thing. The early Zionists were not mostly religious. They were mostly secular. But they mostly came from religious backgrounds, religious homes, and they were very literate in the Bible and the Jewish holy texts. And to the degree that most people who even have a cursory acquaintance with the Bible don't realize, the Bible is a water-suffused document. Further, Jewish prayer, which again, these early Zionists were not given to daily prayer, but they grew up in households that were. The daily prayer service done at home or synagogue talks about water quite a bit. You pray for rain in the Holy Land. So by the time the Zionists arrived in the land of Israel, from wherever they came from, they already were thinking about the role of water, whether actively or passively. They were thinking about the role of water. There was a reverence about water from the first days.
So you kind of touched on this already, but Israel is obviously not the only country built on the desert. All its neighbors are. You mentioned a couple of them, and there are many around the world. What, besides the faith aspect, what were the reasons why they were able to not be limited by these natural resource limitations?
Israel is both an old nation and a new nation. The old part is the religious base, which I talked about a moment ago. The new part is impelled them to sort of reinvent themselves, to create the new man, they called it, new man, new woman. And so that what they end up doing is they start challenging everything. They start challenging science. They start challenging agriculture. And in so doing, whereas these other societies around them were acquiescent in what was, is, what is, was, it's all fine, fate determines, the Zionists did not accept that at all. So by the time the state comes, in 1948, their mindset is completely about innovation and technology and challenging conventional wisdom. And so therefore, that included the natural order of water, that included the natural order of agriculture, and they rip up all the rule book about how you grow plants, where you grow plants, what kind of water you use to grow plants with, and even how you irrigate those crops. And doing all those different elements leads to a revolution in agriculture, which allows them to feed their own people and now to be a net significant multi-billion-dollar exporter of agriculture.
Yeah, and that mindset still exists.
Oh, very much so. That I mean, it's very much a part of the sort of the tech revolution. It's been called sometimes the startup nation mentality. But it's as former President Shimon Peres of Israel says, that this restlessness is very good for science. and very good for the media, but very bad for politicians. Because the people are always pushing, like, it's never good enough. It's good, but it's never quite good enough. And it's the same thing with science. Even today, I mean, I didn't include this in the book, although I could have. Even today, as good as things are in Israel around water, they are still challenging themselves to rip up the rule book again and do it all over again. They have a master plan for 2050 that has them in an even better water profile.
This is a truly epic story, and we'll talk about the story overall later. But talk about some of the characters involved in this story.
Well, you know, it's a fascinating thing. I love reading history, and this is my first time really writing it in this comprehensive way about history. But what we do know about history is that some of the greatest figures get completely forgotten.
Sure, right.
We remember our generals and our prime ministers and presidents and so forth, and some of the arch villains of history. But all of the sort of the quiet good guys get lost. And because I'm not an engineer, and this is not a technical book, I'm a liberal arts kind of a guy, and I wanted to write a book for people like me, I decided to try to find out who were the people who affected this revolution. People completely forgotten to history. Who are the people who invented desalination? Who are the people who thought up the idea that you could take sewage, reprogram it, and turn it into very valuable, drinkable water? But they don't drink it there, but they use it for agriculture. And who are the people who came up with the idea of challenging the natural order of water? And so I found these people, lost to history, tracked down their relatives, tracked down their sons, their daughters, their grandchildren in some cases, and was able to learn family history.
Give us a couple of names.
Well, Simcha Blas, completely lost to history. He is the most remarkable person in water technology and thinking, a complete virtuoso. I've sometimes referred to him as the Leonardo da Vinci of water. Yeah. He arrives in Israel in 1930 out of the MIT of Poland, which itself was miraculous because a Jewish person graduating from the MIT of Poland was a very hard thing to get into. He arrives and he sees very quickly that the great need of the people of a land of Israel, what was then called Palestine, that what they need most is water smarts. And he becomes a self-tutor in water. Within a matter of 5 years, he develops these master plans about water, what to do. And then in 1939, when the British choke off all immigration to Palestine, to the land of Israel, of Jews, he comes up with a plan that shows, and the excuse by the British is it's not enough water.
Right, right.
But it was
only 2 million people could, the land could sustain.
Yeah, and
it's now about 12 million.
Yeah,
right?
12 million now. But it's quite ridiculous. I mean, because the real reason for the British was something completely different, which I talked about in my book.
It was just an excuse.
It was an excuse. But what he goes ahead is he develops, on behalf of the Zionist leadership, he develops a master plan to show the British that the Jews of Europe who are trapped, who they're trying to get out of Europe, that 3, maybe even 4 million of them could immigrate very quickly because there's enough water. He develops this plan. He fails in persuading the British. But come 1948, when the state is declared, they have this master plan that he spent 39, 40, 41 through 43 constantly refreshing and representing to the British. And so when they have their own state, they're ready to rock and roll with a brand new water plan, the first in the world really thinking about water in the way that he was and he did. And so that starts it on a great course. And if I may, about him, just there were others, but he is so remarkable an individual that years and years later, decades later, he ends up getting into a big political fight with the government, famous people like David Ben-Gurion and Levi Eshkol. He ends up getting forced out of government, sitting home, licking his wounds, thinking about what am I going to do next. He's 59 years old. Most people at that age are thinking about, playing pinochle and, and having a nap in the afternoon. He goes ahead and invents drip irrigation, which revolutionizes agriculture everywhere.
And quickly explain what that is.
Okay, what we do mostly in irrigation around the world is the way we grow crops is we do what we did in the time of the ancient Egyptians. We flood the field. Right, yeah. 60% of the water gets lost to evaporation. A lot of it just dribbles needlessly into the soil, and only a very little bit of it hits the roots. What this guy Simcha Blas says is that's crazy. We're wasting all that water. Let's invent these tiny drippers that will drip water at the roots so that will be nothing lost to evaporation, nothing. And then the crops will get all the water they need. Now, what he didn't expect was, and this is great for a world that now has a food scarcity problems, what's great about drip irrigation is it turns out that plants respond to not being flooded with water. And so they actually produce far larger yields, between 25% and 300% greater yields by using drip irrigation.
And quickly, a visionary political leader that was responsible for this epic success? Well,
I would say it was almost across the board, but generally people give the guy who ended up becoming the 3rd Prime Minister of Israel, Levi Eshkol, the pride of place, but I would actually give it to David Ben-Gurion. Yeah. I would say that Ben-Gurion was not just the master thinker about the creation of the state, but he was the guy who also said we're going to make the desert bloom. 60% of the country, as you said in your intro, of the country is desert. And he was the one who said, that's not acceptable. We have to figure out a way to change that.
And Israel is the only country where the desert is receding. in the world.
Yes, yes.
It's
In the
amazing.
20th century, only one country had less desert land at the end of the century than at the beginning, and that's Israel. And that's a significant problem in a drying world where deserts are growing, not shrinking.
Okay. Now, you've mentioned a couple, but give us, you discuss over a dozen factors and actions that the Israelis took in order to get this water abundance. Give us the few headlines.
Okay, so the first thing before I give you the specifics, if I can give you sort of the general viewpoint, which is that lots of time here in America or in the Western world, we think of sort of that silver bullet, the magic cure for the problem.
Right.
And what the Israelis have decided, and to this day, is that there's no one specific single answer. They want to have a multifaceted, overall idea, matrixed idea of good governance, good regulation, smart legislation. They have pricing. They use market mechanisms to tamp down
water
demand.
costs what it costs.
Water costs what it costs.
It's not subsidized in any way.
It's not subsidized in any way, which is not the case. We may think we pay water bills here, and we do, but the water bills are fanciful in America. They're not related to the real cost of the water. So market mechanisms, pricing. As I said before, reformation of agriculture with special seeds that grow well on brackish water, which is otherwise useless water. The idea of, I mentioned drip irrigation. They also take, to a degree that no one else in the world does, they take virtually all of their sewage, treat it to this ultra high level, and then they built a parallel national water infrastructure system to bring that water either to farms, or they build farms where the water terminal ends. And so they've created that. And of course, desalination most recently, which is not exclusively an Israeli invention, but very largely the subject of Israeli transformation.
And they give the scientists and the incentive to participate in this because they work on this and then they keep their own invention and they can sell it, make money?
That's a more recent thing. In the early days of the state, most of this activity was done as state-owned enterprises. So the drip irrigation guys and the drip irrigation wasn't, but the sewage treatment was and the desalination was. Those were all state enterprises. More recently, since like the late 80s, early 90s, what they have started is what they call an incubator program, which is a fantastic idea. The government says to private enterprise, you come up with the next great idea in water and in other technical areas. You come up with the idea. We will subsidize 85% of your R&D budget for 2 years. At the end of that time, either you've got something or you don't. And if you do, we own none of it. You take it. God bless you. We hope you succeed.
Great incentive to come
and
up
this
with
has
great
turned,
ideas.
and that has helped to incubate hundreds of companies. Now, in the water space, they do something else that's fascinating that we should do here. In America, most of the time with utilities, we have the attitude, and agriculture too, we have the attitude of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Right. In Israel, the attitude is, that's never acceptable. So actually, municipalities get fined if they don't, not just don't fix, if they don't integrate new technologies.
Wow.
So all these utilities are rivals to talk to all these young entrepreneurs saying, what else do you have on water that I can try so that I can get this bonus from the government to try this? And when these things work, they migrate to other cities and then to the world.
You know, but all these factors, look, from the beginning, Israel nationalized water. The water belongs to the nation.
Yes.
And in fact, you quote Israel's former water commissioner, Shimon Tal,
Yes.
Who succinctly explained the country's control of water this way. If you put a bucket on the roof of your house and you own the house and you own the bucket, the rain in the bucket is still the property of the government.
That's right.
Now, doesn't all of these factors, doesn't all the success rest on this, that the nation ultimately is in control of all the water?
Well, the success of it is not completely on that, but that's one of those many factors we talked about. And the reason for that is that instead of individual, I don't want to be judgmental, but say individual selfishness. So if a farmer in America has property that is either on top of an aquifer or adjacent to a river, he can do whatever he wants with that water fairly well, and he can harm the interests of people downriver or a farmer next door who doesn't have a drill as deep as his. In Israel, the attitude is, although it's a totally free market economy, it's sort of Bolshevism meets capitalism. You know, the idea in Israel about water is we're going to look for the highest, best use of that water, and the result of that is that everybody has a lot of water.
You coined the term hydro-diplomacy.
Yeah.
What is that?
Well, hydro-diplomacy is the idea that although Israel not only created a great water experience for itself today, it also has used water as a way of reaching out to countries all over the world. Israel is famously diplomatically isolated. And so it has used water as a way to open doors, to start conversations, which sometimes have ultimately become opening doors to diplomatic relations.
Give some examples of some countries.
A couple that would shock you, and it shocked me as I was doing my research. I discovered that from 1962 to 1979, Israel played a seminal role in the water system of the country of Iran. They use this as a way to open the door to an Islamic country, to leapfrog over the Arab states that were implacable foes of theirs, and it opened the door to a tacit understanding that built itself into an extraordinary relationship. In '79, when the Shah falls and the Ayatollahs come, it comes to an end. When they leave, by the way, Iran had a very good water system. Today they have among the world's worst.
But the revolution shows the limitation of hydro-diplomacy. Other things trump it.
But you know, nothing is forever.
Right.
So if you get a 20-year run
Right.
where you go from hostility to friendship is extraordinary. Likewise, China.
Yeah.
China made a deal with the Islamic Conference when it was a less secure global power. And they said to the Islamic Conference, what do we need to get your votes at the UN? And basically the price was have nothing to do with Israel. But China then and now had severe water problems, and they knew Israel had the answers. So as I talk about in my book, in secret, they bring in teams of Israeli hydrologists and geologists to come to China, help them to diagnose the problems, and to help them fix some of the problems. That incrementally, but finally, leads to the establishment of diplomatic relations in the early 1990s. And likewise, around the world today, even though many countries still have no diplomatic relations with Israel, and this is something that shocks many people, I speak to a lot of audiences about this, Israel sells its water technology today to 150 countries around the world.
Right.
There are not 150 countries with which Israel has diplomatic relations.
Right.
So that means Israeli businessmen and businesswomen traveling on Israeli passports are flying almost every day into countries, I want to say which ones, I was promised I wouldn't say their names, but countries that would shock you,
Right.
doing business there, and I'm told passing messages from government to government,
Right.
and as a way of creating a dialogue which may, if not create diplomatic relations, at least reduces the hostility level, so that there's the public voice at the UN, and then there's the more private voice that allows sort of a building of cooperation and coexistence.
And a lot of these countries, the majority of these countries are undeveloped countries that Israel is helping with their water problems.
Well, that's a separate thing. Israel has a robust, if not foreign aid with cash, foreign advice program where about 110 countries around the world are the beneficiary of Israel water expertise. By the way, I hasten to add in terms of hydro-diplomacy, we shouldn't leave out Israel's own neighbors. Israel provides a lot of water to the Palestinians and to the Jordanians every day.
Including the Gaza Strip, right?
Yes, even during the time in the summer of 2014 when the rockets were flying out of Gaza,
They were still providing
Israel
water.
was still every day pumping water into Gaza. 55% of the water of the West Bank comes from the same water source that provides water for Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. It's really, and so that's a story that you don't really read in the newspapers very much.
You never
But
do.
the degree of water cooperation between the Palestinians and the Israelis is really quite something. When you think about all the problems between them, and I don't mean to minimize it, there are
course.
many, many problems. The fact of the matter is that they work so well in water is really quite something as a model.
Well, you know, it's not only the neighbors and not only developing countries that are having water problems.
Yes.
You know, the U.S. government predicts that 40 of our 50 states and 60% of the Earth's land surface will soon face alarming gaps between the supply and growing demands for water. You agree with that assessment?
Well, you know, who am I to say? I do trust government reports, and that was actually, learning about that report was the spark that started me working on this. I'm a member of a think tank called the Council on Foreign Relations, and I was at a meeting where I learned about this report, which said that this growing problem, and this was 3.5 years ago, when, excuse me again, when there was no real California drought to be thinking about.
Right.
And when I learned about this, I became so alarmed as a citizen. How come we don't know about this? That why aren't our public officials talking about this? What are we doing to prepare for this? I began looking for a model that would tell us what we could do to fix our problems. And that's how I stumbled upon the Israel story. And
So what is Israel already doing to combat this more global crisis?
What Israel is doing is it's providing itself as a partner. And for example, the state of California, which is the most famous of our now 8 states that are in severe drought. The state of New Jersey is not in severe drought, but it's at level 1 drought alert now. New York City has massive problems with cracks and leaks in our water system, as does the entire United States infrastructure system here. So Israel is playing a role where invited and where commercial opportunities exist, either or, to open the door. And a lot of this is also helpful in terms of what I might say sort of soft diplomacy or hydro diplomacy. So the state of California, since March of 2014, entered into a memorandum of understanding with the government of Israel, signed by Jerry Brown and Prime Minister Netanyahu, to figure out ways of, from a government to government, business to business, and academic to academic sharing program about big ideas on fixing water problems. And we're seeing all kinds of advances in that, so that Israel now is assisting cities throughout California on remediating polluted water, on coming up with better solutions for broken pipes and cracked pumps, so that there's less water lost, and also sharing with the government government techniques on education to the consumers on how to be smarter about conservation of water.
Anything like that already happening here in New York State, New York City, or the tri-state area?
Well, you know, the problem, Rafi, the problem about this is that we generally don't appreciate the value of water until the well runs dry.
Right,
I'm quoting Benjamin Franklin as saying that. And so the problem is that as long as we turn on the tap and there's all the water we need and want, we don't really think about it very much. But in New York, we suffer from a significant amount of water loss. And so after we've taken the trouble of pumping it and cleaning it and getting it ready to be used into our water system, we then lose depending on the estimate, between 20 and 35% of the water. And so that's a very grievous amount of carbon fuels burned, money wasted, and water lost. And so there's a lot that we can learn from Israel. Israel made a decision about 15 years ago that it was going to stop the breakage of their pipes so that they could fix those leaks. And they were going to replace them and figure out new technologies to find where the leaks are. Israel now is today the second lowest leak country in the world, under 10%, and there's no reason why every community in America can't adopt the technologies that Israel has to find the leaks and fix the leaks. There's one single leak in the New York system that loses 35 million gallons a day and has every day since 1980.
Wow. So, I mean, we can learn that lesson. But I was thinking as I was reading the book, will New York or any part of this country, in fact, ever accept the kind of tight control of water, the draconian control of water, some might say, that the nation has over its water in Israel?
No, I don't, by the way, I don't agree with the characterization. I don't think it's draconian at all. I interviewed 220 people for the book. Some Americans, some Palestinians, mostly Israelis. And some of them were business people, some were government officials, some were academics, and people from different walks of life in touching the water equation. And Israel is a very opinionated society. People have ideas about everything. What was extraordinary to me was that nobody said, this is a bad system. Free marketeers, businessmen, venture capitalists, I challenged them repeatedly. Nobody said this is a bad system. So no one sees it as draconian, because the body doing it is not a political body.
But might we not see it as draconian?
I don't think so. I think, here's what happened was, in our society, particularly in the western states, at a time when we had a lot of water and not a lot of people, we created a system of management of our water. And so today we have a lot of people and not a lot of water, and still, particularly in our western states, we have so many water authorities and water governing bodies. The state of Texas has 4,600 separate water boards. How can you possibly have consistent pricing, infrastructure, regulation, planning, when you have that kind of a fractured water society? The other part of it is, and I think that sooner or later we're going to have to fix this problem, is the idea that people who have historic water rights can have unbridled and endless use of their water is going to have to come to an end. Not because we're going to do it by government fiat, but because we will tell those farmers that what they must do is go from flood irrigation to drip irrigation and leave lots of water downstream for people who need it downriver.
Well, let me finish where I usually begin. This is a story that nobody knows. I think it's fair to say I didn't know it, and I think you didn't know it, as you said when you started.
No.
Why don't we know this story, and why did you decide to be the one to tell it?
Well, why don't we know the story is, it's a very interesting question. It's amazing how much we know about energy. I say to friends all the time, go to the newspaper, the business section of the newspaper, for 5 consecutive days and see how many days in a row you go without seeing an energy story about coal or oil or gas or renewables. And the answer is you won't go more than a day or two. Do the same exact test about water, and you hardly ever see it at all. And the reason is that we have managed to take water for granted because we have been trained to think of it as an inexhaustible resource like sunshine and air. And as long as we think of it in those terms, rather than as a large but exhaustible resource, we're not going to change. And so we will do ourselves a favor by having a mindset change that allows us to start husbanding that resource for the future. And why me? I mean, the reason I decided to get involved in it is I think of myself, as I suspect most of your viewers do, as an engaged and concerned citizen. I didn't hear a lot of people talking about it. I talked to friends of mine who were elected officials. Most of them didn't even know there was a water problem, except for some people from Arizona. And I said to myself, I do different types of public service as an activist, and a little bit like a Paul Revere, I wanted to say there's a shortage coming, and if we plan properly, we can get ahead of it. I'll say one final last word. There's an opportunity to be very pessimistic about our water future, because if we don't fix this problem, we're going to have scarcity, not just in America, but around the world, higher food prices. We're going to see migrations of people, which is going to be very destabilizing. The US government says that this could affect our national security interests. But the other side of the equation is possible as well. We don't have to have bad things coming out of this. We can all be looking at Israel, be more like Israel, model ourselves where we can after Israel, if not everything, then some things, secure a better water future, and we'll have a more harmonious future. And I think that that's a good opportunity for all of us to look forward to.
All right, the book is Let There Be Water, Israel's Solution for a Water-Starved World, and is no surprise that it's already a bestseller. It's a really important and really good read. Seth, thank you so much for joining us
Thanks so
today.
much, real pleasure.